Some films were harmed in the making of this podcast.
Okay, Mr. Mix.
One is the loneliest number that you'll ever do. Two can be as bad as one. It's the loneliest number since the number one.
Hello and welcome to For Your Consideration.
The podcast featuring roundtable discussions reevaluating the cinematic canon of past masterpieces and modern classics.
I'm your host, Dustin Friesenand.
And I'm Mike Josick.
Thanks and welcome to the show.
So just before we get to this week's discussion on Paul Thomas Anderson's Magnolia, I wanted to just point out a couple episodes ago we were talking about the P.T. Anderson movies that I have seen and haven't seen. And I threw out I Heart Huckabees as one of the movies that I had seen of Paul Thomas Anderson's. I do know and understand that that is a David O. Russell movie.
It has been eating at his brain.
I've been waiting for the opportunity to make that correction. And, yeah. When I was editing that episode, I realized what I had said, and I couldn't cut it out because of just the way that everything was sort of structured there. And
I had to talk him down off the ledge. It was terrible.
I feel that my cinephile cred is kind of hanging on this one sort of point. So I know that when I listen to podcasts and I hear somebody make just kind of like a blatant error, I'm always like, oh! So...
And I know whenever I realize that I said something that was wrong later on, I just want to run out and tell everybody who I told, no, wait, I was mistaken. This is the actual thing. I'm sorry, I was wrong. But that just might be an obsessive thing that I do.
So if anybody was listening to that episode and was like, what the hell? I have no more trust or faith in these guys' cinematic ability to analyze and break down movies. Because
maybe that has to do with the 400 subscribers we suddenly lost and the death threats we suddenly received.
I still blame Starship Troopers Month for that.
They were leaving in advance. They knew that you'd make the mistake about I Heart Huckabees.
It's possible. It's very possible. But moving on from that tragedy, emotional tragedy... this week, as we mentioned last week, we're going to be discussing a movie that Dustin's been waiting to talk about and watch again, and that is Paul Thomas Anderson's Magnolia.
AKA that movie about how dads suck and sometimes weird stuff happens like raining frogs.
So let's roll the credits on that quickly. Magnolia was directed by Paul Thomas Anderson. It was produced by Joanne Seller and Paul Thomas Anderson. It was written by Paul Thomas Anderson. It starred Jeremy Blackman, Tom Cruise, Melinda Dillon, Philip Baker Hall, Philip Seymour Hoffman, Ricky Jay, William H. Macy, Alfred Molina, Julianne Moore, John C. Reilly, Jason Robards, and Melora Walters. Music was by John Bryan. Cinematography was by Robert Elswit. It was edited by Dylan Tichenor, or Tykhenor. It was distributed by New Line Cinema and released on December 17th, 1999. This movie's had a lot of awards attention, but does not appear on the AFI list, however.
As opposed to most of the films that we do, this one's actually up to 323rd on the critics poll at Sight and Sound, and 224th on the director's poll. So many of the things we do have just one or two votes.
Yeah, so many of them have like one.
But that's okay. It just means we get to watch more interesting films sometimes.
So, Dustin, you got a chance to watch Magnolia. What did you think?
I've been wanting to see this movie for a good long time, entirely because of a weird power noise track I have, which quotes the old man's dying speech to Philip Seymour Hoffman about regret. And it's a track that I really enjoy, and just it keeps drilling its way into my mind, so I wanted to see the film again. And I was not disappointed. I enjoyed it on a second viewing, even though when I saw it I was a punk teenager who probably didn't know his ass from a hole in the ground. However, I forgot so much about this movie. I remembered basically the raining frogs on Billy Quizboy's face. I won't remember his name.
Donnie.
So I'm just going to refer to him as Billy Quizboy from Venture Brothers. He's basically the same character, minus a claw hand and an eye patch. I remembered the frog rain. I remembered Tom Cruise being angry at his dad. That is about it. I thought it was a bunch of stories that had nothing to do with each other.
Yeah, that's what you told me.
They are woven together very much so. Absolutely nobody's not connected to somebody else.
That was one of the things that actually attracted me to this movie, because traditionally when you have a movie like this, where it's, here's 30 different people and all their stories, they always tie in the end in some way. There's always an intersection.
I thought the intersection was the
frogs.
The frogs, the small area in which it all happens.
The fact that it all happens in the San Fernando Valley.
And I didn't even know it was the San Fernando Valley. In fact, I didn't know it watching it this time until you mentioned it.
But yeah, everything is connected, and generally, either directly or tangentially, has connections to the quiz show, which essentially becomes the focal point kind of the whole film. It's what everything sort of revolves around.
Though I did definitely notice this time around how many shitty fathers there are in this film. There's not a single father who's not a giant turd to their kid.
That was basically my takeaway of this movie, too. I don't know. I honestly don't know if this movie has any other, like, big themes or ideas. All I see is shitty fathers and how they've damaged their children.
For the most part, it's fathers either manipulating or stealing their kids' money, which is what happens to Donnie the quiz boy, and to Stanley the new quiz boy, whose relationship with his dad is just that his dad neglects the crap out of him until, hey, wait, maybe I'll get some money out of this kid. As far as I'm concerned, his is the primary story because his is the damage that's happening currently. Everybody else was stuff that happened in their past and how they're dealing with it, or rather not dealing with it. You have Tom Cruise's character who just completely cut his dad out of his life like a cancer, his dad having cancer, and he became a giant misogynist shit, so I really can't feel any sympathy for that guy. I feel sympathy for his childhood form, however, but he became a complete turd.
Well, he was stuck at 14, taking care of his mother who was dying of cancer, and as Earl, Jason Robards, said to Philip Seymour Hoffman's character, Phil, yeah.
I remember.
He basically watched his mom die and was left responsible for handling that situation because he wasn't there. So you can kind of understand where Frank T.J. Mackey's anger and hatred for his father comes from.
Though I have no idea where the heck his being a shit towards women comes from.
That
unless
whole
that's
seduce and destroy.
That is way too relevant.
It is. Yeah, for a movie that came out in 1999, it was kind of disturbing just how... I mean, if you spend 5 minutes on Facebook or Twitter, like, you hear all of this stuff. I don't know if people are taking stuff from TJ Mackey's book here, or if this was just being prescient. It's so MRA. It's creepy.
Because, I mean, they did have, like, pickup artists back in the day and the shows for, like, in the VIP or whatever, and the whole negging thing. Like, that is all stuff that existed, but the sheer anger and vitriol he shows towards women, that is something that's more MRA these days.
I mean, he starts his whole thing off with, respect the cock, tame the cunt. It's so repellent. It actually took me out of the movie a little bit because I thought Tom Cruise did a really good job portraying Frank Mackey.
Until the interview. In the interview, it felt very Tom Cruise.
But I think there's a level where when Tom Cruise is playing somebody where celebrity is part of that character and part of that character's arc, he can't help but
be himself a
little bit. Yeah, like you watch a film like Vanilla Sky, hell, even Tropic Thunder, where he's playing the agent. I don't know. There's just, yeah, I always feel like the roles where Tom is playing someone who's a little bit self-involved and a bit of a prick, he owns them. It's when he tries to do other things and stretch beyond that where I feel he's lacking usually.
Really? Because I don't think that he does poorly in any of those other roles either. Not that I've seen a whole hell of a lot of Tom Cruise lately in film.
If he's playing like an action hero, or I don't want to get into this. What took me out of the movie was, just getting back to my point, I thought Tom Cruise was doing a really good job, and I thought the writing was actually amazing, but I just kept thinking about that room full of men who paid to be here at this seminar and who purchased these books and who were going to workshop all of these techniques and go out into the world. And it just sort of, I don't know if this is a positive or a negative on the film, but it took me out of the film because I just imagined what happens out of that room after the film, and it took some work to get me to come back to the film.
And I actually kept thinking of, Janet, why are you working for this fuckstick? Why?
Oh, yeah, no kidding, right?
And, like, he's giving her crap over the phone. Like, do your job. I am doing my job. I'm transferring this call to you. It's important. I've vetted this guy. What do you want me to do? I'm here doing my damn job. Because, of course, Earl gets Phil to try to hunt down his son because he wants to sort of apologize, reconnect. Because he's dying, and that's what you do when you're dying. You figure, well, I can use sympathy. Maybe I'll start regretting stuff at this point. Apologize for everything, get in heaven. That's how it works.
And that's actually a nice way to segue a little bit to bring Julianne Moore into the conversation, because she shows up just as Phil is making the call, or is just about to connect. And she, like, slaps the phone out of his hand. She's like, no, Frank is not a part of this family, whatever. Julianne Moore is a tour de force in this movie. She does so much with words. She does so much without words. I mean, I love Julianne Moore as a performer, and I think probably her and Stanley, I believe that's Jeremy Blackman, and John C. Reilly were my 3 favorite performances in this movie. And I just felt everything that Julianne Moore was like. When she freaks out in the pharmacy.
That is probably the best scene, one of the best scenes of the movie.
Like, I felt it. Everything about the way that scene was set up, you feel her discomfort, you feel the judgment, and when he's making those jokes about, oh, you can have a party with this thing, and she's just like, who are you to say these things to me? And
she's going through a lot of stuff right now. She was using Earl, who's probably a bit of a shit, so you wouldn't feel too bad for him, but she fell in love with him at the end of his life, and now she's extremely torn about all of that. What do you do with that? Because you don't want Frank, TJ Mackey, to get any of the money, but she doesn't want the money now. That's not what she's about. So what do you do to try and redeem yourself in your own eyes? How do you live with yourself? And the choice she made was don't.
I will say this movie, it is filled with a lot of really good performances. I think there were moments where actors were probably given license to just sort of be in the moment. There's a lot of, like, air quote, very real kind of talking where it doesn't feel very structured. It's just people yelling at each other or repeating things. And I think that's okay sometimes, but I saw that a lot in this movie. As good as some of these actors are, it is a story. We're not watching a reality show. We're not watching a documentary or an interview. Like, I want some poetry. You know, I want someone to be in control of this. And seeing somebody just basically going, Claudia, shut the fuck up. Claudia, get the fuck out. Claudia, get the fuck out. It's like...
That scene was what killed it for you, and that was an early on scene, and I know that, and you said that.
Yeah, it was a moment where I was like, there's no structure or guiding hand here. This is just a rolling camera.
And as I said at that point, I've seen that conversation happen before.
Yeah, it's a very real conversation, but I think also because that was the first scene we saw her character in. That might have been the first scene we saw his character in, too. The game show host. It was a really
I didn't
weird...
recognize him as the game show host for a while.
It was a really weird intro to these characters. Yeah, it was not something that I liked about the film.
And for the next several hours, you don't have any idea why she's acting as crazy as she is, why she's entirely self-destructive and just will not talk with this guy at all whatsoever.
And I felt a lot more for her character and for her story arc as things went on. And I like these kinds of movies. I like the whole, weaving the tapestry of all of these lives and how they connect. It's a well-written film, and it's a well-directed film. The single shots that they do, the singles, the oneers.
The single shot in the game show studio in particular,
just through the hallways.
Levels through the hallways. Fantastic shot.
It was a superb Steadicam shot, yeah. And I mentioned before the performances, like, the little kid Stanley, like, he was fantastic, and Julianne Moore was fantastic, and John C. Reilly was fantastic, and Tom Cruise was great, and Jason Robards in his final screen appearance was really present and there, and just made me kind of feel for this guy, what he was going through. And Philip Seymour Hoffman, like Tom Cruise, was kind of playing Philip Seymour Hoffman. But I can't remember where I was going with this. We were talking about the technical stuff, the oneers, and the direction, and the writing, and the acting.
Let's jump to the music.
The music. I mean, I like Amy Mann. I'm a fan of Amy Mann. But there was a lot of Amy Mann in this movie. And the music often came on kind of heavy.
And you were saying it might have been the mix, but whatever version I had, the music would often overpower the dialogue.
Yeah, I think that's watching a 5.1 surround audio presentation on a stereo system, because the way your discrete channels are broken up, center speaker stuff like your talking, your dialogue, that falls way to the back, and music and sound effects and stuff are like way up to the front. And it's a reason why a lot of filmmakers will often fight. Like Sam Raimi fought to have a 2.0 stereo audio option on the Spider-Man movies, which Sony did not want to do, but he was like, not everybody has, an amazing surround sound system. Let's let them watch this movie the best way possible, no matter what they're equipped with. So I think that might have been why some of the music was a little bit louder than the dialogue, but even disregarding that, I think the music was still a little heavy-handed. The way a song will be playing, underscoring a scene, but then there's also incidental music within the scene. So you have One Is the Loneliest Number playing, but somebody comes driving up in a car and they're listening to a completely different song on their car stereo. It's a really weird mishmash of music and ways to use music, and it was distracting, and I don't think it really worked. I think I respect what he was trying to do, but it hurt the movie for me.
I'd say the music did hurt the movie for me as well. If I notice it, it's either because it's great or because it's causing an issue. And here, if it was just the audio mix, then it's more forgivable for sure. But otherwise, the songs didn't really do much for me. It was, as you said, a bit heavy-handed, if anything.
And there was that one scene. It's a scene that I actually love, but when they all do the sing-along to Rise Up, I like the song. I like seeing everybody singing the song. But it's so incongruous with, like, the rest of the movie.
Which is supposed to effectively be a very real movie that contains a lot of coincidences. If that song were playing on the radio and a number of people were listening on the radio and all started singing, I think that would have made a lot more sense.
It would have. And the movie does set up at the very beginning, and I told you after we watched the movie, I think it's the whole reason why he has that bridging sequence, or the bookends to the movie. He basically says weird things happen. There are coincidences that are unbelievable, things that you think would only happen in a movie or a story, but they actually happen. Like the guy who decides to commit suicide and he's falling off the building, and the person shoots a shotgun in the apartment, and it just happens to be when he's passing by, and it kills him.
And it happens to be his parents, and he loaded the gun 2 days prior, which blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, and so, I mean, he creates this situation where, impossible things can happen. But this is something that it wasn't even like possible or impossible. It was just breaking the fourth wall kind of, or something. I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, I would say it would be breaking the fourth wall a little bit, for sure.
And while I thought it was beautifully done, it just didn't fit.
But one thing I can say is that the music often underscored the tone of the film, and this is where the music did well. It would capture the tone, and it would go between a bunch of the different stories, where all at the same time, it would shift. Here's a really downer part of all the stories that happens to all be happening at once. The timing of the structure of each of the stories of their lives all matched up really well, and the music would underscore that in a pretty good way.
On a technical level, there's a lot of things that I like about this movie, and I think, I've never seen Boogie Nights, so I didn't see the film that precedes this to see the progression of the filmmaker. I know that Paul Thomas Anderson wanted to make a smaller, more intimate piece, which kind of ballooned. I do think it's funny that Paul Thomas Anderson spoke of this film as essentially he'll never make a better film than this, but then later in his life he said he thought the movie was overlong. And I think that is actually something that works against this movie, despite all of the good bits to it, despite all of the, really interesting direction and cinematography and writing and acting. And
it is a long movie, but I wasn't at the point where I was really feeling it. I noticed it a couple times, the length, but never did I think, oh God, just friggin' end already.
I was getting to that point, but this movie does have this pivot point at the middle where all of a sudden all of these meandering character things all start going downhill. Like downhill in the sense that you're no longer pushing the story uphill, you're just letting it roll. Everything's just finally moving towards its inevitable denouement. And all of a sudden I got to see all the things that were set up, put into play, and then I got more invested in the characters. I think the second half of this movie is way better than the first half.
And I remember you saying that after the film, and I could see that being a much bigger... I think the end of the movie is always more important than the beginning, because if you look at a film like The Sixth Sense, it's a steaming turd, but it had a great ending, and the ending was all that people remembered.
Well, we have talked before about... There was a movie... I can't remember which film it was, but we were talking about the movie, and I said, ultimately, I enjoyed the beginning more than the ending, and had I enjoyed the ending more than the beginning, like when you...
I remember Record, you said like the first half was better in the one than the other, with the Record and Quarantine.
That's what it was, yeah. Yeah, I preferred the
First
ending
half of one
Record.
and the second half of the other.
Yeah, and my preference lay with the film that ended better, because that's the one you want that closure. So it doesn't matter how good the beginning is if it doesn't end well. So I think for this movie, for me, the fact that it ends well and the fact that last hour and a half has a lot more going on and succeeded in picking all of the pieces up and putting them into play in a way that I found really compelling, that's a strength of this movie.
And I know for a lot of people, if you're looking at a 3-hour movie, people might walk out. I've never walked out on a film in my life. I probably should have. I've seen some pretty bad films. But that payoff, the ending, I forgive so much when it comes to the construction, the building, the build-up.
I'm one of those people who hates masturbatory storytelling. You know, when I was younger, I wanted...
No Kevin Smith for you?
I wanted the 6-hour cut of every movie because I wanted everything. And as I've grown older and more discerning, you know, I used to laugh at movies that didn't have a 90-minute running time. If it was 87 minutes, it was up for mocking, because I was like, you couldn't even fill 3 more minutes of story. You couldn't make the magic 90-minute mark. But now, if I see like an 87, 88-minute movie, I'm just like, I'll bet you that movie's either terrible or it's just really tight. And I love Soderbergh's The Limey because it is such a beautiful example of economy in storytelling. And if you can get everything in, if you can tighten it up, I don't want a 4-hour King Kong, you know? Like, The Hobbit is another example of a movie with bloat. Some movies need that time. And I agree with Paul Thomas Anderson. I think this movie was a little overlong, and I think he probably could have tightened it up a little more than it already was. I think maybe a 2.5-hour movie would have been a little more appropriate for this movie.
Whereas I think the length was pretty good. I know it's a long film for sure, and you gotta sit down and invest yourself to watch it, but I'm not too sure necessarily what all you'd cut, because when it comes to character films...
Yeah, I'm not sure either.
How much, if you cut it away, then what was the film we were watching recently where you said that it was overly long, and I said maybe it's actually too short?
That was Two Towers. We were watching the theatrical edition of Two Towers, and Kat made the point that the extended version was better because of the additional scenes with Faramir and a few other things.
And you were saying that those scenes, well, Faramir is kind of unnecessary at this point. We could just cut him out completely.
Exactly.
So it becomes, in order to properly build a character, you're going to have to invest a certain amount of time.
And the reason they left him in was because fans would be like, where's that character?
You can't take him out. He's no Tom Bombadil.
But then you shave it down to a point where you essentially hamstring his character, and then it just feels clumsy. So either they should have just taken some stuff out and just made it a really tight movie, or perhaps you need to watch the 4-hour Two Towers because you need to let it breathe. They cut an entire character out of this movie, out of Magnolia. An entire character's story arc got taken out because... Actually, I don't know the reason why, but I remember hearing them saying that there's a character who had a story and it was taken out for purposes of length or whatever. And I think that's maybe the problem with the length is that, you know, what scenes of Julianne Moore's do you trim? What scenes of Philip Seymour Hoffman's do you trim?
And here's the thing. In this film in particular, although all the stories are connected, they're not necessarily intertwined.
Exactly.
So if you were to cut characters' scenes, you might as well just cut out certain characters entirely. If you were to completely get rid of Donnie the Quiz Boy and all the scenes involving him and John C. Reilly, you wouldn't know otherwise.
You could probably take Donnie out and it wouldn't dramatically affect John C. Reilly's character. You would just have to sort of tweak the ending. But
because John C. Reilly, his purpose is trying to live a good life. He's the most moral character in the show, or at least tries to be, though he buffoons it up a little bit.
But that is sort of his moment where he says, it's all about second chances, right?
It's all about second chances, and sometimes you gotta arrest a guy. Sometimes you gotta go to jail, but sometimes you gotta forgive. And which one do you do? I don't know. It's the hard.
You have to reward or support the person who's trying to do the right thing.
And at that moment, Donnie was, even though he just committed the crime immediately before. But
so much of this movie is also about regret. So that was...
And that's it. Like, you've got the story of these characters who were abused or manipulated or robbed by their fathers, and you see it at many different points. Stanley being the most current one, where he is a kid, and T.J. Mackey being the last one, where his dad's about to die. Well, actually, you've got sort of two stories just like that, with fathers trying to reconnect, who were abused and manipulated in different ways. And I like that you have it at different points throughout the story, and you see the attempt for forgiveness usually near the end, long after the damage has been done. And you have sort of John C. Reilly's, where Donnie, in his minor crime, no damage would be done if he's able to nip it in the bud, if he's able to stop it before it happens. A lot of different time-related events, as far as I'm concerned.
I do think because of the pacing of this movie, you don't really feel... The movie isn't a slog. It's a nice, even pace, and it does have payoff. So, while I still think I could sit down and probably shave 10 or 15 minutes off the story, it's by no means committing any great, cinematic sin by being a 3-hour movie.
Especially since it does have stuff going on the whole time.
There is a lot of characters. There is a lot of stuff going on. Never
was I bored or uninterested.
I had a few moments where I was bored, but I was never uninterested. There was, like I said, there was some stuff at the beginning. I very early on was able to pick the characters that I wanted to see more of and what was happening.
And there's actually a lot of characters who I know that person in real life, including your least favorite character, the drug-addled daughter.
She wasn't my least favorite character. She was just that scene.
Or at least the one that you mentioned specifically as, I can't stand this person. I've known a few of those people in particular.
That scene was just, like I said, it was so unstructured. It was so, what happens if we just let the camera roll and let the actors just sort of be in the moment?
And I enjoy that, because I feel realism makes me more invested in characters. It's not as tight, it's not as well written as it could be, but it creates more of a connection for me.
But so much of this movie is controlled and written. For me, that scene was very much like the scene where all the cast sings. That scene, and I think there's one or two more scenes where something like that happens, where you can tell the actors are just running with it. And because so much of the rest of it feels... It's almost equivalent to if all of a sudden it switched into a different language for like 30 seconds and then switched back to English. Like, it stood out. It didn't feel like it belonged in the way this movie was put together. It felt more like conspicuous.
And certainly with the sing-along scene, I can agree with that entirely.
You can really... It's one of those moments where you really feel the hand of the filmmaker.
And you can feel that hand might be reaching down his pants a little bit.
Slowly unzipping his trousers.
Yes, sing along, you are so relevant.
There are moments where a director, you can tell that the director is just so happy to be working with a certain actor, and it's less about honing the performance, and it's more about, I'm just going to sit back and watch you do what you do.
There's a lot of names in this movie.
And when that's super noticeable, sometimes that just sort of irks me. But that's me.
It is you.
All right, so Magnolia, we've discussed it. Dustin, do you feel this film is a masterpiece or a museum piece?
I was a little wondering where the conversation would lead me, because I was a little bit on the edge, leaning towards masterpiece last night, and I'm actually completely fallen off. I think it's a masterpiece. I think it is a film that evokes lots of emotion, not just because I was emotional yesterday, but as we've said so many times, it's well put together, well acted, well written. It has some flaws here and there, and some of those flaws might be explained by 5.1 surround sound. And I think, yeah, it's a movie that lived up and will continue to live up on into the future.
I like the movie. I wasn't sure what to expect. I've heard a lot of things about it. It's apparently a divisive movie. among Paul Thomas Anderson fans. But
All right.
I think, yeah, some people hate it. Some people think it's a masterpiece. I don't know if it was just people coming off of Boogie Nights, expecting more Boogie Nights and getting this character piece. But I think the fact that so many things in this movie are well done, the uneven bits, the incongruities, the failings, the slip-ups,
They stand out so much more.
So much more. And
It's funny how quality breeds higher standards.
I know. And I think because of that, I have to go with Museum Piece, because I could totally see myself watching this movie again. I could totally see myself changing my opinion of this film. But on a first viewing,
You got to go with the gut.
I gotta go with the gut. And I found it, as I said, uneven. And that imbalance in just about any movie pops it out of masterpiece for me. So I think I probably made my feelings clear throughout the whole discussion. So yeah, I'm going to settle with Museum Piece. So that's one vote for Masterpiece from Dustin and one vote for Museum Piece from myself.
And thus continues the divisiveness of this film.
There you go.
Jack's mother. His mother, Lily. These two that I had and I lost. This is the regret that you make. This is the regret that you make, and there's something you take, and the blah, blah, blah. Something. Give me a cigarette.
Let us know what you guys think if you have seen the film or when you do see the film.
You can check us out on Facebook or on Instagram or Twitter. We're also on YouTube. You can find us on WordPress. We've got a blog on there. And if you get the show off of iTunes, download or stream it, while you're there, please rate and review the show. Getting the responses from people, it puts us up in the podcast rankings. It gets the show into the eyes and the ears of people who may not be listening to us regularly right now. And growing the show is always job number 2. Job number 1 is just making the show.
I think that's important.
I think job number 2 is getting it out there. The show's also available on iHeartRadio and Stitcher. Feel free to share the show on your own social media. Spread it among your friends and family like a bad cold.
Don't jealously hoard us like some sort of dragon.
And if you want to hear more quality programming like this, we also have a Patreon campaign. Feel free to check us out there, patreon.com/FYC show. We've got some, I think, fun reward levels, and you can support us, keep the lights on, pay the hosting, all that kind of stuff that keeps this podcast a-rolling.
And if you want to see more quality programming like this, then you could absolutely install security cameras and pay us to have that all running. I've heard of things like that before. I don't know why anyone would, but
actually,
we are willing to be paid for all sorts of things.
If you want to see more programming, contributing to the Patreon is probably a good way to make sure something like that happens. I'm just saying.
I was kind of hoping for one crazy rich benefactor.
And with that, we bring another scintillating episode of FYC to a close. Thanks so much for joining us. So for next week, we're going to put it to you guys again for another Twitter poll.
We are going to be doing My Own Private Idaho or Princess Mononoke.
2 movies that have nothing to do with each other. Thematically, tonally, artistically.
One's an anime, one's
live action. One's English, one's Japanese.
They both feature people, though only one features monsters, I think. I haven't seen My Own Private Idaho, so... So
we're going to put that up on Twitter. Be sure to check that out, vote, and that'll be up for the week. And whatever wins, we will do next week. So be sure to join us. Thanks so much for listening. We appreciate your support.
I've been your host, Dustin Friesman.
And I'm Mike Josic. Take care.
And ta-ta.
We'll see you next time on For Your Consideration.
What you thought when you first
going to stop. It's not going to stop till you wise up.
Well, we've fallen off on a tangent there.
Anyways.